So there's been a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretations about the quadrant and quadrant system happening in our company, TFR, and I figured um, this would just be a useful resource maybe to refer back to at any point if we are confused and common questions come up. Um, let's try to keep it away from the obvious stuff, and we'll kind of talk from first principles up. Um, Starting with the fundamentals of quadrants and the quadrant system, the very first thing we need to understand is that quadrants are different from the quadrant system. Um, Quadrants describe space. They describe the space for a battle that's happening around a central objective. And that's the key qualifier, a battle around a central objective. The quadrant system is just a way that we play this space to force kills, to force progress, and to create snowballing momentum. Um, but quadrants themselves, right? It's important to understand this because there are many times during a war, many phases like moving between flags, like breaching into a fort, where quadrants don't apply at all because we are not fighting for a central objective. Or to be more accurate, we're not actively fighting for a central objective. And there are no quadrants, so the quadrant system does not apply in these situations. And hopefully that answers one of the most common questions that I've been hearing, or most common confusions rather, which is when are we in the quadrant phase? And when does all of this stuff that we're talking about begin to apply? When do we start thinking about these things, start minding these positions? And that is when both sides are actively looking to control a central point. To be accurate, when we're on attack, it is when even on defense actually, when the objective has changed from moving into position to fighting from it, from moving to the point to controlling it, right? That's the scenario that quadrants describe, and that's when the quadrant system comes into effect. So with that out of the way, um, let's start talking about the quadrant system, right? Where do we begin? All right, let's talk about this concept of strong sides and weak sides. I'm sure everyone has seen, or at least been assigned to a position, in a quadrant in this space. Usually we can say that it's mostly sort of in this L shape where we are assigned. Sometimes we might have a group assigned here as well. But what's important to understand about um, quadrants, right? And I also want to be clear here, when we're talking about quadrants, this is just a natural description of a battle that happens around a point. Or to be more accurate, a competitive battle around a point, right? Um, the sides don't need to be playing the quadrant or quadrant system. They don't need to be playing in quadrants for stuff to look like this, to be described by this, and for you to think about it in terms of the quadrant system. You can see this in any war and sort of apply this framework to it. So it's not something that we're forcing, it's just something that naturally happens. And once you start thinking about it like that, some of these things start to become clearer. And in particular, we start with this concept of a strong side and a weak side, right? Um, so we have, let's say, a strong side, strong sides, and then naturally the opponent has their strong side, right, in this area, and we'll get rid of the scribbles. But the important thing to understand is where these strengths and weaknesses come from. And if you're thinking about it, you might already have an answer in your head that they come from our spawns. And that's right, but to be a little bit more precise and fundamental, they really are based on where the bulk of our forces are coming from, right? Um, and it's an important distinction because there are certain, niche situations where that changes and where we need to recognize that it's changed and not necessarily be so stubborn and bullheaded. Um, but in general, yes, they do come from respawns. So you'll have respawns coming in from the bottom. You'll generally have respawns coming in from a side point. Should always have respawns coming in from a side point. And this creates a strong side here naturally. And it also creates strength in our bottom side, naturally, as people come in and move in this manner. Same thing goes for our opponents, and that's why they have their strong side, and we have our strong side. And it creates, of course, these two opposing L's, right? That we're familiar with. This is important to understand, right? Because, well, there's a situation coming to my mind recently where we didn't adapt so well to this, where in the war plan, we planned to have sort of an L shape that looked like this, right? But instead of sort of giving us this free point on the side, the enemy chose to give up the other two flags and sort of play for this side point, and we continued to play for the far side, when in reality our spawns were coming in from this manner, and we were, with our spawns coming in from this manner, we were attempting to force control like this, which was doomed from the start, and we never sort of changed this, and that's a problem, obviously. And when we understand this principle of like strong sides and weak sides, everyone in our army, regardless of the calls that were being made, should have understood that because of this side point that we control, this is now the natural L shape that we have, and that attempting to sort of force this L shape is just going to leave everyone isolated, right? It's just never going to work without having sort of this control properly set up. So that's one example of it in practice, right? We see that this is the plan. It switches to this just because of where our people are moving in from. Actually, on this note, we can talk a little bit about spawns, since we're on the topic. Side spawns play a very, very crucial role in controlling space, and that is because when we begin spawning from war camp, particularly towards a point that isn't B, and right, when we start spawning at war camp, we have to understand that there's a very limited amount of space that we can move to, and sort of take fights in that are productive, in applying pressure to the central objective, right? Whereas when we're coming in from the side, the enemy has no hope in sort of stopping an individual player from moving in and applying pressure to a central objective. And so when we move in bottom side, and if everyone begins doing this, then it becomes very, very simple for the enemy to just isolate us and keep pushing us down. And no space that anyone takes towards the flanks will ever be useful, just because they will get isolated from the bulk of the army that's down here. And we'll end up in a situation where the only thing keeping you from being spawn camped from being war camped rather, is just the individual skill of the players, which is not where we want to come to. There's no point in playing a war like that. I'm just looking through my notes here really quick. Right. So now that we understand that there's a strong side and there's a weak side, let's actually, before we start talking about the quadrant system a little bit, let's just talk about an individual clump fight. Because typically when there's confusion about quadrants in the quadrant system, there's also confusion about clump fights. So let's try to articulate some things about clump fights. Right. So let's say we have a ball of people here, right? This is the contest area. This is where a big clump fight is happening. Everyone is moving in here. You have IGPTs coming in here, putting down their spells. You have bruisers coming in, dropping their combos, left clicking, whatever it might be. And you have healers paying attention to a big ball of players, right? Um, the fundamental thing we have to understand, right, is, and I'm sure a lot of us experienced this recently, it's just that good players are not going to die to a full combo with, let's say, a mage puts down an Oblivion, puts down, screams a Clump, and then you do your full bruiser combo on it. Um, let's say, you do the Grav Shock Spin, even with a Detonate, and say everything hits, right? Um, it's still, and say you get out everything, I mean, that's still not going to be enough to clear Clumps, right? And we have to fundamentally understand and accept that if players are good, that's just not going to happen. And it's because part of the reason um, is because there are healers standing in and healing this Clump, and they will generally be undisturbed if that is the situation that's happening. When you're piling on very deadly attacks onto a player, um, some of them may be hitting, some of them maybe not, but regardless, none of your debuffs and damage matters, because they will not convert to kills as long as these healers are not hit, right? So whenever we see a Clump, just as a fundamental note, there needs to be one or two people um, that are engaging these healers, making them move, making them run away, making them pay attention to more things, more details, stretching their attention, um, for the sake of creating opportunities and windows where these people inside the Clump, these enemies inside the Clump, can die, right? Now, there's this notion, for some reason, that that is the job of the kill team, right? That our kill team is the one that's supposed to go in and harass these healers. But that's not the case. One, that's just not, it's too much for just a small group of flight armor users to do, especially when there are, at minimum, usually at least 12 healers and an army, our server. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to be able to apply that consistent pressure. So what needs to happen is, especially people who have downtime, who are off their major cooldowns, need to look to move beyond or move around these clumps and start hitting these healers, right? And that is the only way that this clump fight will progress in our favor. And once we understand that fundamental, once we understand that as a mage, as an IGVG, as a BB player, especially, um, as a great sword player, as a bruiser, you look to hit these healers in your downtime. You don't dawdle and look for the next clump. You just look for the healers, hit them a little bit, and then you can turn around and do whatever you need, and then everyone can progress, right? So that's the basic of a singular clump fight. And if anything I'm saying sounds suspect to you, which it really, really shouldn't, um, feel free to just hop in an OPR. Solo queue is an individual player, and just, of course, being mindful of the assassins. Just try this out yourself, and you'll really be amazed at what you as an individual can do for a clump when you start hitting the opponent's healers. But the thing about OPR is that it's a single clump fight, right? When we're talking about a war scenario, there are multiple clumps happening in different locations, all at the same time, and there are choices and decisions that need to be made. And that is why we have a system for organizing and approaching all of that. And it's really, really important that everyone's aware of these basics and fundamentals so that they can effectively pressure and win clump fights that are happening in their respective regions, right? So now we can begin talking about the quadrant system, right?